Hey everyone, and welcome back to another World of Warcraft video. Warlords of Draenor is likely the least fondly remembered World of Warcraft expansion to date. Unfortunately for the developers, one of the things that it's known for is all that cut content, things that were planned before release but did not make it into the game. Now, cut content is entirely normal in game development, and every expansion has a large amount of it, but with Warlords of Draenor, it began to encroach on the core experience. Now, rather than going down a bullet point list of cut content, what we're going to do today is instead look at what was cut, where it was, and work out how it would have slotted into the game, so I can then present you with a picture of what the full potential, realistically, of Warlords of Draenor would have actually been. The Dark Portal was not Blizzard's original plan for Warlords of Draenor. In-game, the orcs tied Azeroth's Dark Portal to their own one that they built, but originally, the link point between these two locations was actually the Chronal Spire. Located in Zangara, this link between worlds would have been involved in our initial foray into Draenor, with it being very, very likely indeed that it was connected to Karazhan on our end. Blizzard had done some work with Karazhan in the lead up to Warlords, and it was commonly thought that this would be involved with the next expansion. Thinking back to, say, Prince Melancar, well, this of course does start to make a little bit more sense when it comes to bizarre timelines. So, the Warlords of Draenor that we didn't play, it might have had a very different beginning indeed. Now, I say this because content gets cut for different reasons. An idea might be rubbish, or it might be too complex, and therefore it would get cut. Or, an idea could be great, but it might not be feasible. It's perfectly possible that the original setup for this expansion was just rubbish, and it was cut because the team preferred the Dark Portal route, not due to the fact that, say, maybe it would have been a lot of dev time to make the Chronal Spire. But okay, the launch. So, be it through a souped-up Dark Portal, Metzin's DeLorean, or the Chronal Spire, we would eventually make our way to Draenor. Now, sure, the initial scenario would have played out a bit differently, but we would have got there eventually. So, the leveling in Draenor was mostly great, but there may have actually been some differences once we examine the cut content if Blizzard's full plan had have been realised. First, Bladespire and Karabor were supposed to be capital cities for the Horde and the Alliance. We know that these were cut specifically for workflow reasons, not really for creative ones. Perhaps this could have seen a little bit more of the story going towards our Draenei and Frostwolf allies, but I doubt it would have dramatically changed the story. There are some other strange quirks though, especially with Yrel. So, Blizzard had teased that she had a dark secret that we did not see in-game. They also planned for her and Murad to be a thing, which they thankfully did abandon pretty early on as an idea. Murad, of course, bringing him up and where he died is a useful segue onto Ogrim Doomhammer. Ogrim is probably the most shafted character in Warlords of Draenor, and we actually know exactly why. During the alpha process, Gorgrond underwent heavy reworks. Originally, much of the Iron Horde storyline, well, it was actually in Gorgrond, and this was to include a story that was exploring the friendship between Durotan and Ogrim. Well, citing complaints over a saturation of orcs, Gorgrond was then reworked to have a lot less of the Iron Horde and a lot more of the jungle storyline. I think this was a humongous mistake in hindsight, as the Iron Horde felt woefully underdeveloped and really just not that threatening for the whole expansion. Perhaps having some story here would have really helped out with that. So, by this time though, we've went through a few zones and we've likely ran into the garrison system. One of the big cut features is that you were originally supposed to be able to place your garrison in any of the zones. Each zone had an area that was pretty much earmarked for a garrison, and the idea was that if you wanted to at a later date move it around, well, you pretty much would be able to change your mind and move it. This plan was scrapped when the developers wanted your garrison acquisition to be a stronger part of the story. Now, I don't buy into this reasoning because being able to just move your garrison at max level, that would have been fine. Now, the garrisons themselves were actually supposed to be larger and really supposed to have more of their options shifted towards max level, but eventually Blizzard made them a bit smaller to be easy to navigate. They beefed up some of the building effects so they gave you access to, and they gave you access to it a bit earlier on. Now by this stage in the video, we've made our way to Draenor, we've done most of the zones, we've got our garrison, and we're approaching max level. And I don't think there's really that much to talk about with NAGRAND and Spires, two of the later zones. They were both great. But what about TANAAN? So, TANAAN was originally supposed to be there fully for launch. I've seen many think that TANAAN Jungle was to be a max level only zone, just like the Vale of Eternal Blossoms. This makes a lot more sense than it just being another leveling zone, and when you look at how bare the endgame of base Warlords of Draenor was, I think this makes a lot of sense. Its absence certainly could be felt. Now, it does seem like Hellfire Citadel was always planned to be the final raid, so fighting a ground war in TANAAN Jungle, well, it would have made a lot of sense. The combination of this zone and a full storyline in Gorgrond being cut, I think they really are the things which started to make the Iron Horde not really feel like a proper villain. Parallels between TANAAN and the Vale of course bring up the topic of reputations, which is a strange thing for Warlords. The reps in this expansion were just mob grinds with really no content, a complete 180 from what we saw in Mists of Pandaria. While I do think that the developers did want to avoid the daily quest burnout issue that hit at the start of MoP, this was almost certainly a development time constraint related issue. So there's a look at the launch Warlords, maybe in an ideal world. Perhaps we would have went in through the Chronal Spire. We would have had a pretty similar leveling up experience, maybe with a few character alterations, and perhaps way more in the way of Ogrim, Doomhammer, and the Iron Horde. We then, of course, would have still been going into Highmaul and Blackrock Foundry to raid, as we did on live. As for garrisons, yeah, sure, they might have played out a bit differently, but the real changes only really come into play after launch. And this brings us on to Shattrath City. The team planned to do a raid tier in Shattrath City. While the only solid evidence is from an old art panel at BlizzCon, let's just say sometimes I come across information and yeah, it was planned. So this raid tier did not happen, and this, in my view, is why much of this expansion to players felt gutted. The middle chapter was pretty much removed. We also did find out in the beta that Farallon, a planned island zone, had been cut from their plan. It was always supposed to be a patch, but it was cut from the plan, with TANAAN Jungle being deferred to a content patch taking the place of Farallon. These announcements, in combination with us knowing that Shattrath was a planned raid tier at some point, certainly do suggest that at some point there was a massive pivot in the team's plan. They had been gearing up for a large secret or plot development at Shattrath. I think that's pretty obvious. I mean, look at the place, it was sealed off by that massive dome. My suspicion is that patch 6.2 originally would have been the Shattrath raid, along with some new garrison campaign stuff, new legendary quest stuff, and then some form of new world content. Would that world content be Farallon? Well, that's hard to know. According to Ian Hazzikostas, Farallon was originally going to be used as a level boost character starter zone, but with the level boosts being integrated into TANAAN Jungle, there wasn't really much need for it. That could be true, I guess. We don't know exactly what happened here. We know that it was planned to be a patch because they did say that at some point, but overall, it was just a bit strange, and it seems like the development process for Warlords was a bit derailed, and once that happened, they had to make some hard choices to cut things. By the time that many of these decisions were being made, the impending doom of Warlords of Draenor was likely becoming quite apparent to the team. Now, for my part in all of this, I did kind of call this going down exactly as it did in the Warlords of Draenor beta, where in my pre-launch review I basically said it will perform amazingly. Initially, it will get amazing review scores, but it will struggle to last outside of a month, bar for the raiding population. Now, the developers would have known this long before the beta testers did. As much as it's easy to be an armchair game dev and pretend we're all smart, ultimately they probably are smarter, and they probably do see all of these problems coming further off than we do. So I think what happened then is they decided to cut Warlords and refocus on what would become Legion. You might be a bit surprised by my thoughts on this decision, which I will cover later, but let's just go through the rest of Warlords first. So, okay, we've leveled up with our new cast of characters, we've knocked out Highmaul, we've knocked out Blackrock Foundry, and we've done whatever the hell the dev team planned with Shattrath City. So, what happens next? Well, Legion was pretty much always supposed to be the next expansion after Warlords. Remember, this stuff is all known well in advance by the team, so ending on a Legion-themed raid was pretty much always going to happen. It seems like Hellfire Citadel was actually the plan, which is a little bit tricky in a world where we perhaps would have been fighting in TANAAN jungle since day one. It does still make sense for major narrative events to happen, leading to the opening of the raid and perhaps changes to the TANAAN jungle zone. After all, that is how it went down with, say, Icecrown Citadel and the Siege of Orgrimmar with what happened in the Vale of Eternal Blossoms. The world content plans here, though, I'll admit they are quite sketchy. They could have thrown in a new island. Maybe, it would have been strange, so we have TANAAN in 6.0, Firelon in 6.2, what would we have in 6.3 or 6.4? Kind of hard to know. They could have just put something in, though. I mean, as great as it was, who actually saw the Timeless Isle coming? Not many people. So what would have been different about this expansion if it had have went to plan, as we've kind of laid out here with the major content? Well, it would have lasted another patch with another major raid tier. It would have had a bit more content at launch, but it probably still would have had systems that would be close enough to what we saw on live servers. I think that having more fleshed out reputations and maybe a sort of, a TANAAN being a zone at endgame at launch, maybe a bit like the Vale, I think they would have been good core improvements to the initial launch experience of Warlords, and perhaps they would have been able to keep people interested for another month, maybe another 2 months. The Shattrath raid tier and the accompanying content would have gone a long way to fleshing out the expansion's breadth of content. It would have given potentially great characters like Yril a full character arc, instead of giving them a start and an end, but no real middle, leading to her rise to power being rather preposterous, especially when this patch would have had her, likely, journeying with us into Shattrath and discovering whatever that epic bit of story would have been. Overall, you would have been getting a far more complete package, but here's why that might not have been a good thing. It still would have been Warlords of Draenor. It would have had those problems. A few decent reputations and a better plotline are great, but do they fix a game design that's fundamentally flawed? No, I don't think they do. Players would still have felt chained to their garrison. Ashran probably still would have been a bit of a dud, even if we had have got the much larger Ashran that was originally promised, that had siege engines and all that stuff. The dungeons would have been irrelevant after a short period of time, just as they were on live. So, let's just say another raid tier that extended the expansion by 6 months happened. Would they have been a great 6 months, or would we have just been sort of stuck in this broken expansion for more time? They certainly would have bumped the subs up a bit and kept it going. Would it have been great overall? Especially since dev time to make that would have been taken away from Legion, pushing its launch further and further back. I mean, imagine Hellfire Citadel launching 6 or 7 months later than it did, but being followed up by the same content drought. Would 6 months of Shattrath have been worth that, or would it have been a content injection to a game that at the core was still hampered by its systems? I think that perhaps the only way that Warlords of Draenor could have worked is if things such as the Mythic Dungeon feature that was added in 6.2.2 made it in earlier on. So, how about this? If a Shattrath patch had have came out that also bundled in a host of, say, systems changes, Warlords of Draenor could have been salvaged. So if the Mythic Dungeon system of late Warlords and maybe Time Walking, if they were added in the middle, and then the expansion was 6 months longer due to there being a new raid tier, well, that could have worked. And I think this is the fascinating part of Warlords of Draenor for me. There is a case to be made that the pragmatic response to this expansion was to gut it and get Legion out the gate. But, on the other hand, it did mean the customers did not get as much value for their money, and all of this happened against the backdrop of more store mounts, and generally it was a very dark period of time for the game, probably its darkest. So if we were to draw this into some sort of conclusion, I suppose it is this. Sure, Warlords of Draenor could have had more content, but at the end of the day, its biggest problem was systems, and if they were never planning to do a patch that had the balls to basically revamp what a garrison meant to that expansion, or revamp what world content meant to that expansion, then I can see why they chose to get Warlords of Draenor over with as quickly as possible so that they could move on to Legion, at least when we try to think about this pragmatically. Obviously, I paid money for Warlords of Draenor, you paid money for Warlords of Draenor, and I do not think that any of us got a particularly great value from that product. So there you go, a bit of a rundown, a retrospective of Warlords, one that was a bit more focused on what ideal Warlords of Draenor would have actually been. So, that's it from me. Let me know what you thought about this expansion down in the comments, and with all that, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.